Welcome to A Lawyer's Guide to the Galaxy, a podcast about geek culture by lawyers with your hosts, Ben Siders and Kirk Damon.
And welcome back to A Lawyer's Guide to the Galaxy, the podcast that asks interesting questions that don't have any answers with your host, Ben Siders. That's me. And the other guy is Kirk Damon.
That's Kirk, as in the captain of the Enterprise.
We are intellectual property lawyers and certified geeks practicing law in St. Louis, Missouri. You can find me, Ben, on Twitter at Benjamin Siders, and you can find Kirk at KirkDMN, and you can find this podcast at LGG Pod. In an amazing turn of events, we are now recording, we're recording a second episode this year.
Second episode this year, and within a week of the first one.
It's going to be our fourth episode that we're releasing. So if you've been listening to our new stuff this season, you will know that we had a new episode on Trivia Night a couple weeks ago, and then two back episodes we recorded in January that I am just now getting out the door. And now we have a new episode, Season 7, Episode 4. We're going to talk about, it's kind of a peculiar topic, Kirk.
This is a really peculiar topic, actually, but we got started talking about this, and it fascinated us, and we went down a rabbit hole, and now want to talk about it.
Yeah, it's fan communities and changing distribution models, which may sound boring, but bear with us. We were just talking about how, it kind of got started because we were talking about how there's two models for distributing TV content now.
It started because we were talking about The Mandalorian.
Yeah, Mandalorian. And we were talking about how, and we'll get into this in a second, but although it's on streaming, it feels like a syndicated TV show the way the episodes are constructed. You can not watch an episode and miss one and come back to it and pretty much not miss anything. Nothing that happens in any one episode mostly doesn't affect the overarching plot, which felt to us kind of like Star Trek: The Next Generation and maybe to a lesser extent Deep Space Nine. So we got into speculating about why and how there's changing distribution models and how how these content creators are structuring their releases for maximum fan community engagement, and just how that's changed over the years between the pre-cable era, the cable era, and where we are now.
Yeah, so it's a lot of it. What it was is we were talking about how, as kids when we grew up, their TV had a different feel. You didn't have this idea of, TV being, an entire season being one show, being continuous plot lines, and streaming kind of did that. And where we were really talking about it was in conjunction with The Mandalorian, which I'm currently watching season 3, having not seen season 3 yet. And we were discussing the fact that it seems like the only things that sort of advance the common plot is the first and last 5 minutes.
Yeah.
Which, having watched 2 episodes since we had this conversation yesterday, is entirely true. But what you have is sort of a self-contained story between those 2 5-minute windows. And that's the way shows kind of used to work.
Yeah.
So that's what got us started thinking about this. Got us thinking about the fact of why is that, why would you potentially change that?
Because they're not all like that. We noticed that Andor's not really like that. Andor is more like a Netflix series where if you miss the last episode, the next one might not make a lot of sense. You kind of have to know everything that happened. Yeah,
there's a real thing that's it seems like some of the shows require you to really be watching them in order and to watch them in fairly close proximity to each other, having any idea what's going on.
Andor in particular is dense.
Yeah, whereas other ones definitely allow you to sort of watch an episode, skip a couple weeks, see another episode. They're kind of that more serialized model. And as part of that, we started thinking about why is this, what has changed in the models. It got us thinking about fan communities, which also got us thinking about fan interaction with IP, which is where we realized this needed to become a podcast episode.
And for once, we're actually going to just record the episode rather than talk about it for days on end and then forget about it. Okay, so we thought we'd start by kind of reminding you of where we've been, especially our younger audience members, which we gather is quite a few based on the people we talk to at conventions and stuff. There was a time before we had the internet and before we had cable.
Back when dinosaurs roamed the earth.
When if you wanted to watch a TV show, you had to look up what time it was on your local stations in TV Guide, and you either were there to watch it or not. And if you missed it, then you just missed it.
And for younger listeners, I even have this with my kids, it's one of the things, the concept of TV meant you had to be in front of the TV in that hour window. There was no delaying it. There was no, moving it around.
If you were lucky, you had a VCR, maybe, and you could record it and watch it later.
Early on, I think, VCR technology was still, I'm growing up before VCR technology comes into play at all. It was something where you had, and if you had a thunderstorm and couldn't get, decent reception, you watched it with bad reception.
Just out of luck, yeah.
And so it's those kind of things where it was very, very rigidly sort of positioned. The one place you really see this sort of in modern things, and I think it's something people don't realize, is with holiday specials. It used to be that, holiday specials would air basically once a year. So if you wanted to see Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer, you had to figure out when it was going to be on. You had to be in front of the TV in that time period, and you had to do it. And as a kid, one of the things is, this was an aspect of my homework and the aspect of doing things. I wanted to watch MacGyver on Monday nights. I had to have my homework done before MacGyver started. If I didn't, I missed the beginning of MacGyver. And there was no getting that back. I couldn't delay it. I couldn't, watch it half an hour later, anything like that. There was this feel that you had to be there. You had to participate in it.
Well, and TV Guide was exciting because you could go to the index and see what movies were going to be on broadcast TV for the next couple of weeks.
You also had a lot of advertisements on TV for, coming soon, coming this Sunday. And there were a lot of time slots that were common. So one of the ones is The Wonderful World of Disney. It was always on Sunday night. They would air some Disney movie on Sunday night. You didn't know which one it was going to be. It was immediately after Mutual of Omaha's Wild Kingdom.
Yes.
Which is, if you guys have never seen it as a show, is one of the earliest, I would say, sort of true animal shows. And one is still probably the best. I mean, up there was Jacques Cousteau. But the thing that you really had with it was this sort of fixed time window, this fixed idea of TV was something you sort of sat down and saw. But as part of it, it was also, you could miss episodes.
Yeah.
You really had the thing, if you sat down and watched Star Trek, every Star Trek episode was self-contained.
Well, also, the people making the show did not know when and which episodes and in what order they would be aired because it was syndicated. So the local TV station was just a company that showed up to work in the morning, turned the TV station on, started broadcasting, and then when the day was over, they turned it off and went home.
Another important thing to keep in mind about this, and I think it's something that's sort of gone by the wayside, is summer reruns. So it used to be that, new TV was always, fall to spring.
Yeah.
And then during the summer, they just played reruns of things. Even if they tried to play the syndicated shows in order, which I think they did try to mostly play them in order.
They usually tried to, but you couldn't be guaranteed of that.
Yeah, you couldn't be guaranteed of it. What they would then start doing is during the summer, you would have shows in random order. And it was the kind of thing where occasionally in summer, you'd watch, you'd be watching, a certain show every week or every day, and you'd suddenly get a part 2 before they ever aired part 1 of a 2-part episode. And that was really the thing. It was very rare that you had any kind of episodes that connected. If you did, the episodes would very clearly state they were part 1 and part 2 of an episode.
Yeah, and those were usually that's where the cliffhanger came from. Was the one thing you could be pretty sure of is that the last episode of the season would almost always be aired last. And the first episode of the next season would almost always be aired first. So if you wanted to have good participation from viewers, you would put together 2-parters that had a cliffhanger that spanned the summer season. And I think, the most common one all of us grew up with was the Borg episode where who was it? Jonathan Frakes. Riker says fire, and Picard is on the Borg cube, and we had to wait all summer to see what would happen. And I had a conflict and couldn't see the episode. I think to this day, maybe I've still not seen the second part episode. So it was a big deal, and shows were made with that in mind. And
it's worth noting, even the cliffhanger at the end of the season was a relatively new thing. Again, for those of you who are younger, I'm not going to go into the big thing. If you want to learn about the creation of the season-ending cliffhanger, go to Google and type in "Who Shot JR?"
Yeah, Dallas.
Which is Dallas. Who Shot JR was the season ending for a show called Dallas, which was a very popular sort of evening soap opera, evening drama, for lack of a better way of putting it. My parents used to watch it. I remember watching it.
Dallas and Dynasty,
Dallas
and Dynasty, dramatic ones,
and Fantasy Island. And so you had that kind of thing going on. One of the things that you had with it was all summer people are speculating it ends with JR as the lead character in it, who's a very unlikable character, but very successful is the way they do it. In the end, he's an oil magnate. In the end, you see him getting shot. You see a hand holding the gun. You just see the gun barrel, basically. You see him getting shot and him lying on the ground. And that's the end of the season. And the whole question is, who shoots him and is he going to survive? And this was an open question. People did not know. All
summer, yep.
All summer, and it was a huge issue. It was one of the most watched TV shows when it first came back on.
It's become a pop culture meme now. Like The Simpsons did the Who Shot Mr. Burns episode.
Exactly.
Like all these, joke shows make fun of it now.
Yeah, and so, but it's worth noting that in some respects, I think that was the first real season-ending cliffhanger that they had. Definitely the first big one. But I think that gets us to, and I think the way we're going to talk about this is we wanted to talk a little bit about the distribution and sort of what we can see in distribution, and then IP issues that arose out of this.
Yeah,
and fan interaction issues.
We see this
out of this
start to change with cable, even like the early premium TV, like the HBOs and Showtimes. What they would bring to the table was that since you had to pay for it and it wasn't on broadcast TV, it didn't have to follow the same FCC rules. So all of a sudden, you could have swearing, profanity, violence, nudity, all the things you couldn't do on broadcast TV. That's the main thing you paid for, plus access to comedy shows and things like that, again with swearing and inappropriate conduct or inappropriate content.
They'd also, and I think everybody knows, the original name of HBO was Home Box Office.
Yeah.
A lot of the things behind it was that they would broadcast movies that weren't edited for television.
Yeah.
And so when movies would air, they would air originally, obviously in a theater, but when they would air on TV, they always ended up, they had to edit out certain language. They had to cut them to pan and scan, so they actually
break them for commercials.
And they had to break them for commercials. And so because of that, they also had to fit them into 2-hour time slots. So movies would get cut down. They would lose scenes when they were aired on TV. They were different. One of the big premises of Home Box Office is because they didn't have to put commercials during the show. And actually, in many respects, they started off not doing commercials at all. That was the whole premise of paying for TV. They could air the movie without breaks in its entirety. And since they didn't have the FCC requirements on language, they also didn't have to edit any of the talking, any of the speaking to change wording. So you, for the first time, really got to watch movies at home. And that's, I would say that's the first thing HBO really did. And in many respects was the starting premise for cable. But then they had to fill their time slots. And so they came up with other things to fill their time slots.
Yeah, and there was almost no original content at first, and really no serialization. It was just access to premium content, movies and things like that you just couldn't get on broadcast TV. We were talking about this in the context of Star Trek: The Next Generation, which comes out in the late 80s and ends in the early 90s, and kind of spans or maybe starts...
Maybe the mid-90s more accurate when I think about it.
I think the last episode was my senior year of high school, which would have been 93 or 94, somewhere in there.
Yeah, I would put it, it's definitely, it's after 92, because it was after... I graduated. It
was after Deep Space Nine started.
93, 94, maybe where it was, type timing.
But if you remember Star Trek: The Next Generation, or if you watch it now, you'll notice that the first probably 4 or 5 seasons are very episodic, very syndicated, where, there might be occasional callbacks to things that have happened before, but they're pretty rare, and they're not really material to the plot.
Yep.
In the last couple of seasons, you get a lot more sustained story arcs. You get the Klingon Civil War, you get Worf's family dishonor drama, you get more recurring stuff with the Borg. They bring back Q for the last couple of episodes.
Yeah, no, Q was a recurring character. He obviously occurs in the first 2-part episode, and they did have him come back.
A couple times.
Really
like once a season, usually, he comes back. But again, it's one episode out of, a 20-episode season usually, so if you didn't remember who it was, they could reintroduce him really quickly in an introductory scene, and you knew everything you needed to know about Q.
One other thing to mention with this thing is this is also where you started to get a little bit of the previously seen on type things, which was also a reference to what we were talking about with Mandalorian, is the idea of referencing back to what happened in prior episodes. A lot of times was done because you needed to make an explanation, particularly in these 2-part episodes, recognizing the person may not have seen the episode that you need them to have seen.
So they need to know enough for it to make sense. So we don't really see a shift to full serialization until the mid-90s. According to ChatGPT, Oz is the first fully serialized HBO drama. But the one that kind of put the serialization format on the map to where you have to watch everything in order is The Sopranos, the first original content premium cable breakout hit. Now, I think we had Alias was also kind of like that in the early 2000s, but The Sopranos started in 1999 and kind of established this new format and that it was commercially viable.
Yeah, and what you really had is you definitely had it start off, I think, on cable. The reason being, again, because cable being a premium channel, they weren't reliant upon advertisers. They weren't reliant. They had much more control over what they could broadcast because, again, they were doing all the broadcast. So you could do things like, okay, we're going to show The Sopranos. We're going to show it, we're going to show every show once a week so people who are watching it. But we also could spend a Saturday and just show all the episodes back to back in case you missed anything. Mm-hmm. And that kind of stuff did happen on cable on a regular basis where they would do these long runs to allow you to get caught up on stuff, not just in TV. But I remember as a kid, one of the ones was a weekend where you could watch every James Bond movie back to back.
Yeah, there's always the James Bond marathons on TNT.
And it was one of those things where it was really useful if you'd missed one because you could figure out what order they were going to be in. You could go and you could see something you'd missed. And they always aired them in the release order. So you could actually see them sort of in order, however you wanted to see them. But yeah, I think you'd see it as it was really the the premium channels having much more control over their timing. Again, there's also no syndication. They're one station. It's being broadcast to everybody. That's the nature of cable. Was allowing them to basically say, no, we're going to control this. We're going to do it. And that lack of FCC rules allowed them to sort of dodge some of the other problems.
So in the late 90s, we start to see, even before The Sopranos, a gradual shift to a more hybrid format. DS9 was like this, Babylon 5, Buffy the Vampire Slayer, The X-Files. There's still episodic shows, but there's more and more of each season's narrative is devoted to serving an overall narrative arc that is either season-long or maybe even spans multiple seasons. Like Deep Space Nine is like that, where the very first episode establishes the Bajorans and the wormhole and the Bajoran gods that live there, the time gods that the Kais worship, and
so little about DS9 I remember. I have to admit.
I mentioned Kai Wynn to Kirk the other day. He's like, I don't remember who that is. And those story elements came back, especially towards the end of the Dominion War, where you had sort of season-long arcs. But each individual episode was still mostly self-contained enough that if you missed something, you could follow it. This didn't really change. The Sopranos started to change, but one thing Kirk and I had kind of forgotten about when we were researching this episode was they did this on network TV too, earlier than we remembered. In 2004, we had a little show called Lost, which started to do this serialized format on network TV, which, if you think about it, in 2004, that's pretty audacious.
Yeah, well, and I'm going to mention one of the things I think that is an important aspect of this, is because it's a show I loved, which was Babylon 5. And one of the things I always remember being a major issue of Babylon 5, so we're talking late 90s, it's been mid to late 90s at this point in time. One of the key things about it was they had the Hugo Awards, which was the awards that were given for great episodes of science fiction. And you were allowed to nominate for the Hugo Awards a single episode or a specific multi-part episode. So if you had a two-part episode, you were allowed to nominate the two parts as a single episode. Babylon 5 was nominated by the fans for season 3, for the entirety of season 3, and there was a huge question as to whether or not that met the criteria for being a Hugo Award of a single episode. And it was determined that it was significant enough connected that it was a single episode.
Which is interesting, right? It means that they kind of understood even then that the concept of the episode was less about the runtime and the staging of the story than about the overarching narrative cohesion.
Yep. And I think it's an interesting thing to point that out, because it's there was questions in the awards community and in the community around this as to what it meant to be an episode, and this was changing. You could have, is it appropriate to nominate an entire season as one episode versus just your standard two-part, end of season, start of season type of two-part episode, or like Encounter at Farpoint starting Star Trek The Next Generation being a single episode, two parts, stuff like that. So I think that's a really important thing to do. And that happened kind of early on, but Babylon 5 was definitely a hybrid model. It was not one that was done to be that serialized. It just happened that there was a very coherent sort of storyline that went through that. We really see it with, I think, the rise of Lost.
That's where, and Battlestar Galactica comes out the same time. Now, Battlestar Galactica is on Sci-Fi, so it's a little bit different. But Lost is on network TV, and it's fully serialized.
It's on CBS, I believe, wasn't it?
Or NBC, I forget which. Remember. That may have been the golden era of NBC. Then Alias also was kind of in this time frame, although it's kind of a forgotten show. But Lost is remarkable for that they pulled this off on network TV pretty successfully. It was extremely popular, and Lost is also notable because this is when we finally get into the IP issues that are interesting here, because Lost, because they did this on network TV, there was all this fan speculation about what the hell is really going on in this show.
And there were a lot of things done in the show that were designed to lead to speculation. I mean, if you'd seen it early on, if you watched the early episodes, lots of the numbers, the polar bear, the smoke, the four-toed statue, which is something they never went back to. Everybody forgets about that one. There's all these kind of things. What the heck's going on? What is this storyline? And suddenly it is an ongoing storyline. It was also purposefully engaging the internet. It was using the internet
viral marketing. They had the Dharma Initiative website.
Yeah, they actually had sites you could go to get additional information about the show.
The deliberate Easter egg planting.
Yep, deliberate Easter egg planting, some of which were also deliberate red herrings.
Yeah. And bear in mind, this is all before social media. This is all stuff you had to find on the web somewhere. We had MySpace, but Facebook wasn't available to everybody in 2004.
Yeah, and even MySpace wasn't really the what people think of as social media today. Yeah. It was a place where you could go visit people and things like that, but it was in some sense visiting a web page. But the thing I think you really had with, and I like the idea of the Dharma Initiative website being one of the key pieces of it, of the website being part of the entertainment, part of the show that was put out by the show's producers, that was, it was designed to be part of it. But then you have all the fan stuff springing up. So you have like message boards springing up to discuss Lost.
Wikis to collect all the information.
Yeah. And part of it was because there was such huge amounts of information that fans did. Whereas, it's still a show airing on TV. You could miss an episode. And if you needed it, but now most people can record it. You have, general rise of VCRs. Most people have the ability to record. I think you even have TiVos at this point in time. You have sort of digital recording. And so the idea of it basically being, yes, you can record it. You could, catch the episodes you missed.
It's an interesting question. Was the widespread availability of TiVos and similar types of technology? Because by then your cable company also would just give you a DVR device, with your cable subscription. And did they maybe figure out at that point that pretty much everybody had that, so you could serialize it on network TV? Because if somebody missed one, well, they could just record it.
Yeah, and there was, I think, a lot of understanding of that. One of the things I always think is interesting about, people understanding the existence of VCRs, and I always remembered this from what it was, too. Again, I'm going to pick on Babylon 5. The very last episode of Babylon 5, in the credits, they actually post up a screen that says, "Since we know you're all recording this." And basically, they then show every person that was involved in the entire production, all 5 seasons, in just 1-second shots. But the point being, they know that you could take your VCR and watch it on pause or on slow motion and see them all. A real recognition that people were recording this, that there now was this ability to sort of go back and review stuff. You could put little one-shot things and little one-shot frames that people could go back and analyze in depth. And they were doing it. You have the rise of the communities. You have Yahoo groups kind of being the big rise at this point in time, and there's another one that arose like Yahoo groups. Can't remember who it was.
Google had a groups thing too.
Okay,
but they were pretty new still at the time.
These sort of group of things that were getting together. I mean, isn't this the early days of Reddit?
I wasn't on Reddit until like 5 years ago, so
okay,
I don't know.
I want to say there's groups like that are popping up as well that are just these discussions where people can have these kind of discussions. They can go through them, and fans can talk with each other about what is going on. And again, I think that Lost is the real birth of this. And Lost was the first show to really take advantage of it, where they did put a lot of little red herrings, of little things in conjunction with it. Lost was also, I think, a show that had always been designed, sort of like Babylon 5 was, but other shows were not really designed with, as having an overarching arc. X-Files did, but X-Files was designed to just be an overarching conspiracy.
It was still conspiracy of the week type format. Yeah.
But being the nature of the show being about conspiracies and about hidden government things, it was good to have an overarching conspiracy controlling everything because it fit the plot, even if you never learned anything about it.
Yeah. Which you often did not.
Which I did not. But Lost really had this coherent storyline going through it. At the same time, even Lost was done as a season. So Lost really ran a season. The one thing that they did is they tended to resolve the sort of question of the season at the end. But by the time they filmed the season finale, I think they knew they'd been renewed.
Yep.
So they would then create what was going to be the question for the next season. But obviously it gave them the ability, if the show wasn't renewed, they could simply stop it there. You know, they could solve the last problem and stop it there. And that was part of the problem as well with doing this idea of longer story arcs, is you didn't know if the show was going to get renewed.
You never knew how much runway you really had. So each season had to kind of wind things up somewhat satisfyingly, or you'd really annoy the heck out of your fan base.
Yeah, and actually the best show that did that was Millennium, which was an X-Files, sort of the same guy who made X-Files, he also made Millennium, which was a show that kind of ended part way through the conspiracy, and you never found out the answer to. You never found out what the Millennium Project was. You never really learned anything about it, even though I thought in many respects it was a very good show. I enjoyed it a lot. It's one of those things where, to this day, I have no idea what the show is about because it never ended.
Well, and so the fan community engagement, though, became a double-edged sword, and I don't know if they really anticipated this or not. Lost certainly embraced it, but that was not always the case for all content producers. Because these fan communities would pull together Wikipedias and web and content and provide a lot of information about the story. So if you did miss the episode, you could go to the wiki and find the episode summaries and the plot summaries, and fans would be stitching together different elements and coming up with theories. And there's a risk of this because if the direction the show ultimately went happened to mirror those fan communities, did the fans coincidentally get lucky and see it coming, or is there an argument that the showrunners were watching those communities and stealing their ideas?
Yeah, and that was the thing you had, is you bumped into this where all of a sudden all these things that sort of the producers hadn't worried about with fan interaction because of the fact that it was ephemeral, it suddenly wasn't. You also had even more direct copyright infringement. And to jump back to our episode we'd done on Trivia Nights, you have fans reposting video clips because they can now do that. They can go through and they can say, but they're doing it because they're analyzing what's going in them. They're generating trivia questions because they're posting little we're getting into these issues with Trivia Nights. And again, sort of, Ty, why are we doing this episode now? Knowing that we recorded this immediately after our, Trivia Night episode. That's part of the reason is we're getting into these same questions we got into that, but now from a different angle.
And these websites that kind of document the shows are kind of more like the Seinfeld trivia book from our last, 3 episodes ago now when you're listening to this, kind of more like that than a trivia night where it is written down. So as opposed to somebody just asking a question at a bar and answering it, which is, kind of hard to pursue somebody over. Now we have a specific place where it's written down and being published to the world, and then you kind of have to put it to the content creators at that point. Do you let that go or not? Because it probably is, at least on some level, a copyright infringement. Maybe not a very compelling one, but there's at least an argument there. And so do you let it go or not?
The other two things we have rising at this point in time to keep in mind, we actually have the start of the podcast starting at this point in time as well. I mean, 2005, 2006, really podcast
Battlestar Galactica was
starting.
famous for that. Ron Moore, who ran that, always had a podcast talking about the episodes, which is now part and parcel of almost every TV show now has a corresponding podcast that goes with it.
But you also have most of these podcasts are third parties. These are guys who are individual fans that are putting together podcasts to talk about it, to do analysis of it, to do what we've done on this podcast. Yeah. But you talk about, there are podcasts that are dedicated to talking about particular properties with third parties. The people are also getting, they're starting to get fame out of this. They're potentially getting revenue out of this. You're starting to see this model makes a lot of sense. Like it really is helping the TV studios.
And we have YouTube coming shortly where it's all going to be vlogs and video, which is even more direct in terms of infringement when you replay clips and stuff.
But now you have a very strong loss of control by the studios around this, which I think they're seeing as being valuable. But at the same time, from an IP point of view, how do we keep control of this? And you do have the issues like you're talking about is what if they take a fan, idea? Is a fan going to suddenly sue and say that was my idea? And I think that at the start of this, I think the answer was that would have never happened. People would have said, hey, you got it right. But it's a still legitimate sort of concern. You also have the concern, and the one that's always been speculated from Lost, is early on there was a speculation on Lost web pages and things like that Lost was purgatory. The people were in purgatory. And very, very quickly they sort of jumped in and said, no, that's not true. Yet if anybody's seen the entire end of Lost, spoilers alert, it is true. And if you haven't seen the things, at least that's sort of the way they imply it at the end. I mean, it's not, the end is not completely clear. But they do sort of imply that, behind it. And again, spoiler alert for Lost. If you don't know that by now, then go watch the show because it's excellent.
The first couple seasons.
The first couple seasons are. But the things that you really sort of get into, from it is, you have these fan communities. You couldn't necessarily keep secrets anymore. You could have sort of surprises, these surprises get guessed because you've got so many people doing this. And then how do you interact with somebody coming in and saying, we have this fan theory, this is what it is. And it turns out that fan theory is right, but you don't want anybody to know that it's right. What do you do? And so I think you've got all that kind of arising too. So you've really got this sort of very, for lack of a better term, I think fraught era in conjunction with the early 2000s around this. Now, I mean, for me is what it is. I'm also starting to practice law around this time. And so I'm seeing some of this stuff come into here, things around that. One other thing to keep in mind that you have at this point in time is also the rise of Napster. And that sounds a bit disconnected, but I think it's worth pointing out where you finally start to have wide-scale copyright infringement occurring digitally.
Yeah.
In a distribution model that just plain didn't exist. And I think that's also part of what the studios are seeing is they're seeing, in this happen in conjunction with music and them being worried of how do we deal with this around video and what does that potentially mean for video.
And that kind of brings us to where we are now, where a lot of the content is on streaming. I mean, there is still network stuff, but you basically have two models for distribution now. One is kind of the traditional episodic model where a new season of content comes out and you release an episode, usually once a week. Maybe you skip a week here and there if there's a big national event or a holiday or something. But for the most part, you release one episode a week, and seasons are a lot shorter. The 20, 25, 30 episode seasons are 8 8 to 10, maybe 12 at the high end now for a lot of this content, especially the original content that is, on a specific channel like a Disney Plus.
And a lot of them aren't even released as season 1. They're released as just the show, and then there's a determination, I think, later on if it's a season 1 or not.
Yeah. So that's probably still the main way this gets done. And the other model, which is pretty much just Netflix now, is the binge model, where the whole season is done, we drop it all at once, and you can sit down and set your weekend aside and watch the entire thing. House of Cards, according to the internet at least, that's what kind of started this. But probably the most famous example of this is Stranger Things.
Yeah, Stranger Things. And I joke about it because it's the only show I have ever binge watched is Stranger Things.
But you didn't watch it on streaming.
But I didn't watch it on streaming. I bought the DVDs and then couldn't stop watching the DVDs and watch the entirety of season 1, one evening and can show you. And admittedly, I've only seen season 1. I haven't even seen season 2.
You've seen the best one.
But it's part of the reason for it was because I didn't have Netflix. I got the DVDs at the time, so I wanted to see it. And by the season 2 had already come out. And then by the time I got Netflix, it was in like season 4. And I kind of lost interest in watching Stranger Things and started watching other things. But it is interesting in the fact that you have the comment of binging TV. That was a big deal for a while, sitting down and binging TV and watching TV and that kind of thing, which is, I think, a little bit fallen by the wayside. It's not quite as much of culture now as it used to be.
Yeah, I agree. I don't know if that's because Netflix doesn't produce as much content or there's so much competition, but my hunch is that the problem with the binging is once the show drops, somebody somewhere is going to watch all of it immediately. And at that point, we're in spoiler alert era where you can just know everything that's going to happen and you lose all of that lost type of fan speculation about where the show is going, things like that. And I think the studios have, for the most part, landed on the episodic format is overall better for sustained fan engagement and probably delivery of strategic advertising and subscription services, because I can just buy my Netflix account, get all the Stranger Things stuff, watch it all and cancel. Whereas if I want to watch Andor, you can spread it out over at least 2 months and double the number of subscription fees you get out of it.
So you want to watch it on time, you have to actually, subscribe to Disney Plus for a couple months. You can watch it, you can binge it later on, but you're going to be late to the game to see it. And so I think that's also part of it is that they're catering to a double audience. If you release it in the more, sort of episodic format, you're looking at it and saying, people who want to watch it on time, you're going to have the speculation during the week between episodes. But at the end, if you want to binge, if you just want to wait, not deal with it and just binge watch it at the end, well, you can, because at the end, you can just watch all the episodes back to back. And again, I'm going to pick on The Mandalorian season 3, which I wasn't able to watch, as it was coming through, just because partially transition to the fact that my son has lost interest in Star Wars. And so I'm watching it more on my own or with my wife than I was watching it with him. But we're still watching it somewhat episodically, but we'll watch 1 or 2 episodes at once, and it's what we have time for and sort of stuff like that. It's a good show to do that.
I'm just now going through Andor season 2. I think I've seen 3 episodes.
I've only seen 1, so but I have Skeleton Crew on you. I've seen Skeleton Crew, and you haven't seen that yet.
Well, so we've noticed that even though within this model, so Netflix is still on the binge model. Amazon does a little bit of both, but it's mostly on the episodic model. But the vast majority of these, Handmaid's Tale is on Hulu. It's over now, but that's the episodic model. But Disney Plus is probably our main interest because that's where all the Star Wars content is, and the Paramount shows, which has all the Star Trek stuff and all of the Sheridan verse for
Sheridan verse,
the Yellowstone, all those shows. Those are all very very much the episodic model. But even within those, you have the shows that are syndicated style episodic, like The Bad Batch or The Mandalorian for the most part. And then you have the stuff like Acolyte and Andor, which is more in the binge model or the serialization model, we should say. And we were trying to figure out why that is. Why is Disney making them both ways? And all we could come up with is differences in audiences. The Mandalorian seems to be made more for, and I don't mean this pejoratively, but the ADHD generation, where you want to sit down, you want wall-to-wall spectacle and action, and I don't want to stop and think about it too hard. And Bad Batch is kind of like that too. And that makes sense for Bad Batch especially. It's animated. It's going to tend to attract a younger audience. That makes a lot of sense. Mandalorian, that one's tough. Like, I feel like it skews a little older in terms of the tone and the themes, but it is still made in that sort of episodic style where there is an overarching plot, but for the most part, you can ignore it and still enjoy the episodes.
I think we talked about it a little bit. I think one of the questions you really get here is the fan popularity of certain episodes and certain things versus others. Like we've commented about, both of us enjoying Andor, enjoying the big world building sort of feel of it. Lends itself more to a longer format, where lots is going on, but you need lots of time to pass, lots of, things to go on to understand what it is. Whereas Mandalorian tends to have self-contained plots within the episode, even if there are bigger ties to a larger plot that's sort of out there. And that may lead to different viewership being interested in it. I think, for us being, way too deep into the Star Wars universe, we enjoy investigating these fine, small points and having them pop back, as to what things reference and things like that.
We're also cinephiles and cinema nerds, right?
Yeah.
If you're a casual even if you're a serious Star Wars fan, if you're not a big movie buff but you like Star Wars, something like Andor is going to be a frustrating experience because it's not a cinematic style of storytelling.
Yeah, that's very true. It really is a much more long format, and sometimes it's more like a book, for lack of a better term. Or maybe an audio book is a good way to sort of put it. But yeah, it really has those difference in feels. And part of it you wonder is Disney trying to sort of cater towards one or both of those audiences, but still using the episodic release to build up the idea of, particularly in something like Star Wars, something like Marvel, they have big properties that have huge followings, huge online evaluation, to keep it from being the person who can binge watch it and give away all the spoilers right away if you were to release it as one true thing. Or the problem that if they're so serialized, that watching it as the episodes is annoying.
Yeah.
And I think that's where they're trying to find that happy medium. They go both directions a little bit. Sometimes they hit it a little bit better for what the content is. Sometimes they don't. But I think that's what you're really seeing. You're seeing this idea of saying, what is the format? And I'm just going to jump back into some of our prior podcasts and things we've talked about. We've talked repeatedly about the idea of the serialization just being a very long movie. And in some
Stranger
sense,
Things is
true.
like that. It's really just a long movie with some commercial breaks every hour and a half.
And the question is, do you like that format? Is that an appropriate format for what the story you want to tell? Do you want to tell a 12-hour movie, tell Lord of the Rings? Or do you want to tell a 2-hour movie? Or do you want to tell 15 one-hour stories? Or do you want to tell 15 sort of interconnected one-hour stories?
Yeah.
There's a bunch of different formats now which somewhat relate to how you release it. But they also relate to how you interact with the fan community.
Well, the Acolyte, I think, is especially interesting because we started with Andor, and when we were talking about this episode yesterday, we were kind of speculating where does the Acolyte fit, and we both felt it was more Andor-like in narrative structure, and I think maybe that's why it didn't work, because the Acolyte, in terms of themes and topics, to me, it's clearly trying to reach a younger, newer, different audience. But the storytelling narrative structure was designed to appeal to, I think, an older audience, and maybe that's why that just didn't work as well, because there's a little bit of disconnect between who they were trying to reach and how they were trying to reach them.
Yeah, they misfit the two. We kind of, as we said, the Acolyte lends itself to fast action Star Wars, lightsaber battles, like the second half of Episode 1, which is a self-contained 1-hour thing, and most people enjoy. It takes, 8 or 9 hours to do it. So you kind of have this 8 or 9 hour, half-hour long show that's then presented in a format which says, no, it's going to be an in-depth 8 or 9 hour show, but kind of lacks the depth to do it. And is that why we had a disconnect? Because it put the wrong form to the style, the style of what it was presenting and the plot of what it was presenting disconnected. Yeah,
and it's really interesting to think about that in terms of, there's a lot that goes into how you make these shows successful. It's not just having a good story. There's a lot that goes into the narrative structure of how you tell the story. And then now, how do you release it? And it will be really interesting to see if Disney ever decides to mix it up. And maybe they do at some point, do a binge watch type show. We were talking about the problem with that, though, is once you do that, you drop everything, and all of the many tens of millions of dollars you poured into the show, you get an immediate bounce in the commercial upside for it. And if you don't recover everything you want in that immediate bounce, you may never.
Yep.
It's a really risky format, and the fact that everybody except for Netflix is kind of getting away from it kind of makes me think that may be a dying model.
It may be, but I think I want to pull in, and one of the things we want to talk about is let's talk about some other media in that model. And what I particularly wanted to get into with it is what's interesting about the binge model is there's one form of growing media that can't avoid it, which is the video game industry.
Yeah.
And so what you bump into is that with video games now, you have these large narrative video games. I mean, we all know what they are that are out there. I'm not talking about the free-to-play, Marvel Rivals, League of Legends, these kind of combat
even your
type
action
of
games,
things.
your Grand Theft Autos have like an overarching narrative and characters, and we've done episodes on these characters. There have been lawsuits filed over them.
Yeah, and sort of major issues in conjunction with things like that, where they have these. I look at a lot of the horror series that are really doing these things. Five Nights at Freddy's. Probably is a Playtime. I keep screwing up the name of the video game, but these things have large stories that are self-contained in the video game that you have to play through the video game to get.
Sometimes multiple times to get at everything.
But one of the problems you bump into with it is there's no way to release the video game not on the binge model. You have to release the video game.
Yeah.
And when you release the video game, there will be streamers who play all the way through it in however quickly they can do it. And then, and they're recording the entire time they're doing it. And it's all the time. The only time it delays is how long it takes them to edit their podcast.
Yeah, exactly.
And
all the cinematic cutscenes are going to be on YouTube or Vimeo or something pretty soon.
And, them discussing it, them having the things with it. So they have to release these binge watching things for these video games, recognizing these video games can take hours to play through. But they have to do it. But what you've really seen there is the idea of it's still episodic. It's just episodic of each game. Mm-hmm. So what you really have is a release of a 4 to 5 hour, let's say, video game, oftentimes even longer than that potentially to play through it. But if we say a 4 to 5 hour show is being the entirety of a streaming season, but what we're really seeing is the build-up being the between seasons, and the idea where they release a lot of spoilers, they release a lot of short trailers. There's speculation, there's things that they modify to mess around with, stuff like that they post up. We have that binge model. It's just moving out of TV and moving into video games. And is that part of what we see in conjunction with these things? Is that really there is still a place for the binge model, but the binge model requires a more interactive season.
Yeah, and we're thinking about this in terms of with video game makers in particular. They have the same problem. Once you drop the game and you get your money for it, you're pretty much gotten what you're going to get out of it. So how do you sustain the interest until you can get to the first expansion or whatever else you're going to do? And what immediately came to mind there is Baldur's Gate 3, which Kirk has not played yet, but I have. And Baldur's Gate 3 in particular embeds this sort of design philosophy of multiple replayability with a different experience every time, not just in the gameplay, because it's a D&D game, so depending on what class, if you're playing it as a wizard, it's going to feel different than playing it as a warrior, but also that game has different narrative elements and a lot of spidering and branching plot elements that each playthrough is different based on the choices you make with your character. So when I first played through it, I accidentally killed one of the characters you're supposed to befriend, and so I got all the way to the end, and I'm trying to read through how to get through parts of the game, and people were like, "Oh, just have so and so do this." I'm like, that character died like in the first 5 minutes. I can't have her do that.
Yeah.
You'll see with Baldur's Gate, streamers especially are still to this day. That game's been out for over a year, maybe 2 years now. Streamers are still trying to find all of the cutscenes, all of the dialogue options. Depending on what choices you make, you unlock things that maybe nobody's seen before, which is one way you get around the binging problem, is having such a complex narrative structure that you have a lot of replayability.
Yeah, and that's, again, the video game has the advantage that it's fully interactive. You have to seek out this stuff, whereas obviously in TV, you can't. The TV episode is the TV episode. There's no hidden episodes. But you have, interestingly enough, you also see, I think, some of that sort of general sort of, playability is what it is, playing out strangely in like YouTube streamers, where it's the idea not even that they're doing the replayability, but even in their streams, they're playing with this idea of we're going to have multiple storylines, we're going to have multiple things. So I'm thinking of YouTube streamers that create content that's more like TV. They're amateur, animators, sort of things like that. A lot of them use video game engines to generate their stuff. But the idea being, we can make all this interactive sort of content because we can make it quickly. It's not hard to make something that uses, Minecraft as your animation engine and you're just doing voiceovers. You can make a half-hour episode every week, no problem. We can just explore a whole lot because it's more interactive, because we can interact with fans, or because of the fact that we can just change the plot line whenever we feel like it. We have something more like Baldur's Gate in the video game where its interactivity allows it to follow the binge model because it doesn't matter.
And I think the most important IP you should take away from this, because this is a question we get, especially from younger people a lot, is how do streamers get away with this? How do I have this stuff on Twitch? How do I have these YouTube videos? Why is it that if I include 3 seconds of a song, it gets taken down, but people put up 45-minute videos of Minecraft and nobody says anything? And the short answer is that they could have you take it down. They choose not to because they view it as a net benefit to the game and the marketability. Minecraft is perhaps the best example of that. I mean, they do updates and new releases and they add features and stuff, but the fundamental gameplay and mechanics have not changed in 15 years. The game came out in 2011. It is still the most popular video game ever that keeps finding new generations of players every year. And I think they recognize that the YouTube culture and the fan lore that's grown up around it is a huge reason for that.
And I think part of it also is because that's such an open universe that, there's lore that's grown up, which has nothing to do with the video game. It's lore grown up around, Minecraft and stuff like that. There's lore that's outside that uses Minecraft, which has nothing to do with Minecraft. But again, I think the real key about it is it's what are they choosing to do? And that's the thing that to me gets really interesting in the IP law questions with this is not an area where there's any kind of clear rules. We talked about fan fiction before. We talked about the trivia nights. We sort of talked about a lot of this fan interaction with IP properties and things like that. This is an area where we had kind of the technology dramatically change the interaction. And it has dramatically changed the interaction. If you think about the way people interact with TV today, and you compare that to, let's say, the mid-1980s, they look nothing alike.
Yeah, it's very different.
There's nothing to do with each other. It's completely different. And that's kind of what we were doing with the walkthrough of the timeline at the beginning of this. But what we also see behind it is the IP law hasn't really changed that much in this area. We think about statute or what the IP laws cover. Yes, the courts have addressed some of these issues. But this is an area where the copyright law in 1980 is not fundamentally different from the copyright law today when it comes to infringement of a movie.
Well, here's what I find perhaps most interesting about this. For a long time, there's sort of this mythology that if I'm not making any money off of it, it doesn't matter. That's less true these days. I think it used to be more true, not as a legal thing, but as a practical thing. If I'm not costing the company any money, they're not going to care. And I think that's more a matter of the practicalities of enforcement. It costs too much to enforce. You're only going to go after people who are either making a bunch of money that should be yours or that are costing you a bunch of money. And if they're not, you just let it go. Not that you couldn't enforce if you wanted to. You could, but you just chose not to. I think the calculus has changed now. There are people who make a living off of streaming based in large part off this third-party IP, and I think more and more IP owners are willing to just let that go because it's not a competitive use. It does actually enhance the market. It's part of the sort of the free marketing for the property. Minecraft is a great example of that, but there's lore growing up around all kinds of stuff. The Roblox games are a good example of that. My kids are obsessed with doors and rooms and all these horror games on Roblox. Friday Night at Freddy's has a lot of kind of fan lore around it. And I think these things, there's a time 10 years ago I would have said, arguing that your fan content amplifies the market for the original is not a defense. It's probably still not a defense legally, but I think practically it's a lot more tolerated than it used to be, even if you're making money off of it.
At the same time, to the other side of that, I think you also have a recognition of the studios that they want to have control over this. Yeah. And so you bump into the idea of them saying, no, we want you to be a licensed streamer. We want you to abide by our rules. So yes, we have no problem with you being a streamer and doing this.
Within a certain range of
conduct. And, with you doing certain things, but it's also and what we'll do is if you agree to abide by it, we'll give you the pre-release copy so you can get the releases out there and things like that. But you are doing so at their whim. They can choose to back off and say, no, we're not going to support you as a streamer anymore because we don't like what you said, in conjunction with something of one of your episodes. That happens on a regular basis. But you really have this sort of idea of saying they want to be in control of it. And what you bump into, and I think this is part of the problem, is how do you break into into this issue with both sides? So if I'm a small video game producer and I put out a small video game, I'm not going to discourage streamers because I want the free marketing. But then if that video game starts to get big, I may discourage streamers because it starts to damage the brand. How much do we get into these sort of concerns of this is size, this is a follow the money type of problem? And if you're looking at it as somebody trying to say, hey, I want to break into the streaming business, how do I do so? Do I have to infringe IP in order to do so? And the answer is, well, you may. but that comes with its own risks,
Yeah.
Of doing it. And if you're a small content creator, do I need to protect my, how do I get the free marketing without, but still maintain my, well, you may have to, take these sort of trade-offs and issues around that. And I think that's the really key thing in some sense to do as a takeaway from what this episode is about.
Yeah.
Is what we're seeing here a lot of is different trade-offs. They're different trade-offs than what we were. If you go back to, again, let's pick on the sort of, 1980s, 1990s. I think there are very few people who owned a VHS camera and did not generate fan movies.
Oh, of course.
But they didn't have YouTube to distribute them.
Yeah.
You
Your audience was whoever was in your house.
Yeah, exactly. You put on videotape, it was your friends and family. The studio never even found out you did it. That was the kind of, because, there was no way for them to find out about it.
Yeah.
And so those are the kind of things that you really see now is you've seen this distribution model and the nature of what it is has dramatically changed what's going on. And as part of dramatically changing it has also changed how the IP infringement is and what it potentially could occur. And that's resulted in a new set of trade-offs.
So, and one final thought on that just kind of occurred to me as you were talking is maybe what's happening here is the content creators are seeing that streamers and YouTubers and the sort of fan community, if you officially hire them as influencers, there's rules you have to follow. There's disclosures you have to make. By just saying we're going to mostly keep our hands off of it and let you go about it, you get the free pub that you get out of it. That's influencer-like, organic marketing, without having to follow all of those rules by officially hiring these people to do this. And then you can kind of use your copyrights to selectively enforce which ones you like and don't like.
But you also lose control.
You also lose some control over it. And it'll be interesting to see if the law evolves in any way to recognize that this is maybe a loophole in FTC enforcement over influencers.
Yeah, I think there is an interesting thing where, and again, as a takeaway from this is to basically point out, we have a new series of trade-offs. And to me, that's the thing that really we're talking about here is it's so much of what we're bumping into is a copyright law, that laws that, are combined. Think about the idea is 1985 is 30 years ago. 40 years ago. Sorry.
No, you can't say that kind of stuff.
But, that's not that long. And so when you talk about the idea, especially the evolution of law, 45 years is incredibly short in conjunction with the evolution of law. Yet we have had a technological evolution which has radically changed the interaction of properties and their fans in ways that nobody even expected.
Yeah.
And so we've got an old law. We've got new enforcement, but we also have just simply new questions of what should we enforce, how do we enforce, and things like that. And you've got people looking at it and saying, how do I do this, successfully from both sides of the equation and not really knowing the answer. So again, we've said on this podcast a lot of times the hard part with this thing is there's no good answers to this. We say asking interesting questions with no real answers. I think that's the answer here. There is no real answer to this. There's no thing behind it, but it's a very interesting thing to look at what has happened and how that's potentially affected what's going on.
Absolutely. All right. So next week, this week, the Supreme Court, this week we're recording on June 10th. For the next day or two, the Supreme Court is supposed to meet and talk about a case that may have long-lasting effects on our copyright rules. We will see if they grant cert. If they do, we will cover that in our next episode. If not, we'll find something else to talk about. So by the time you're listening to this, that decision will have been made, and so you'll find out, then what exactly that is and what we talk about with it.
Very good.
All right, that's all for this time. We'll see you next time. Lorem, play us out.
The views expressed by the participants of this program are their own and do not represent the views of, nor are they endorsed by Lewis Rice LLC, its officers, directors, employees, agents, representatives, shareholders, and subsidiaries. None of the content should be considered legal advice. As always, consult a lawyer. This podcast was produced and recorded in St. Louis, Missouri.